everybody. Welcome to In This Family, where I have in-depth conversations with fascinating people about mental health, family, the past, and the future. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray, President and CEO of Nexus Family Healing, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and your host. In This Family is presented by Nexus Family Healing. We are a national nonprofit mental health organization who helps youth and families heal from trauma and complex mental health challenges. We believe every child is worth it and every family matters. So today we're going to talk about substance use disorder, addiction, which is a disease just like any other. It's intermingled often with mental health issues that can cause cognitive, behavioral, and physiological symptoms. Substance use disorder is not a moral failing. It's not a character flaw, and it is not a condition anyone would choose to have. The great news is that, like many illnesses, it can be treated and people can recover, even though at times it can be a lifelong pursuit. We also know that having a family history of addiction increases the chance that someone can inherit the condition. But family can also be a very important element in somebody's recovery. Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation has been doing groundbreaking work for people struggling with addiction for decades. Hazelden was founded in 1949 in Center City, Minnesota, while Betty Ford Center began in 1982, and then the two merged together in 2015. Today, we are honored to have a discussion with Dr. Joseph Lee. He is an expert in the addiction field. He is also a child and adolescent psychiatrist by training and is board certified in addiction medicine. Dr. Lee has been with Hazelden Betty Ford for 17 years, and he is now in his 5th year as the president and CEO. Dr. Lee grew up in Oklahoma, and right now he lives in Minnesota with his wife, who is a pediatric oncologist, and their 2 sons. I had an absolutely illuminating and inspiring conversation with Dr. Lee about substance use, the wild misconceptions around addiction, and small practical steps that families can take to make a difference. Dr. Joseph Lee, welcome to the show.
Yeah, Michelle, it's a pleasure to meet you. Please call me Joe. We'll go on a first name basis for this dialogue.
Well, that's really great. And I'm wondering if you could start by what got you into the field?
I don't, like some of our thought leaders, have an incredibly inspirational personal story of addiction and recovery. But I came into it because, as a medical resident at Duke University, I would see people with addiction predominantly in emergency rooms. And when you're only seeing addiction in emergency rooms, you can understand why there's stigma about addiction, because you're seeing people sometimes at their worst moments. And you can see why the discrimination and the stereotypes occur. But I had a great experience at Duke University in my residency. That was my adult psychiatry residency, where I got to see some of these same people at a treatment facility in North Carolina called Fellowship Hall. And I saw these individuals transformed. And as I started to witness their journey of transformation, it really kind of re-sparked in me all the whys, why I became a physician, why I wanted to be a part of the healing profession. And so I kept that in my heart as I did my child psychiatry residency in inner city Baltimore at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And then when my fellowship was done, I knew I wanted to specialize in addiction for young people, and I wanted to help families. And there was a place that you could come and do some training and get addiction certification, and that was just Hazelden at the time. It was before the Betty Ford merger. Yeah. And so I came to Minnesota in 2008, and I've been here ever since.
Well, I want to go back to something that you said. It seemed like you really saw the magic that was happening when people were healing. Say more about what did you notice? What did you see when people are working on their healing process?
Addiction, of course, is a medical condition, and it's a treatable illness. And actually, unlike the stereotypes, many people in addiction, millions of people get well. Lots of people get well, and some don't even go to treatment, and so people do get well. And so the prognosis is not what the media headlines portray them to be, despite the tragic overdose numbers and whatnot. But I do also think that stigma for addiction exists for a reason, because a lot of unfortunate things happen on that journey of addiction. People are harmed, families are neglected, there's abuse and violence, and there's all kinds of stuff that happens on the road to addiction. And I think in medicine, how I was taught and raised, we weren't taught a lot about how to handle addiction. We were told what it was, what the symptoms were, but we weren't really told how to interface with it. We weren't really told how the mechanism of the transformation occurs. We would have lectures in medical school about attendings who had become addicted physicians and were now in recovery, and they would talk to us about their journey. And it was always somewhat surreal. And then, of course, when I entered residency, you see people who are in the emergency room, and some of them are brought in by the police, and some of them are inebriated. And so they're not in their best moments. And that only reinforces all the stereotypes you have about addiction. And then when I started this rotation at a treatment site called Fellowship Hall in Greensboro, North Carolina, I saw some of the same patients that I saw in the emergency room at Duke, but they were different. I saw them in 3 dimensions, and they spoke about their families, and they spoke about their principles, and they lived out those principles. And you could see that when they were given a chance to be free from some of the grips of the addiction and how powerful that pull is, that they were the best version of themselves. And then not only that, because recovery from addiction is not just getting back to normal, and you might find this to be true, Michelle, too, is that people in recovery are more than. They are better than well. They actually, it's not just about being sober from substances. On their journey, they come to understand how to have the right perspective in life, how to express gratitude, how to give back. And to see that side of humanity was just incredibly inspirational. And I think in the medical culture, so much of addiction is like, do you use drugs or do you drink alcohol or not drink alcohol? And they don't speak to that other journey, the suffering, the shame, the loneliness that people go through. And then when they reach out in groups to other people, often, how they find hope and transformation, and they become really the best versions of themselves, and they become a gift to society, and they spend their lives helping so many other people.
I'm really glad you're speaking to that. And I loved how you also reminded us that this is a disease, like any other disease. And we have to remember that, and I love that you went through the trajectory of people really getting in there and finding their resiliency through their healing journey. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I think if you look at the long view, the prognosis from addiction is actually better, at least comparable to other chronic illnesses that we face all the time, heart disease, diabetes, other things. And we are so blinded by the tragic things that happen on the path, or the ups and downs of early recovery. People return to use, and I think we get very myopic, and those things color our long-term view. But when you actually follow the research and people stay engaged in care, so many of them do well. And not only do they do well, I think they have an important wisdom that they need to share with society. I actually think, and I felt this initially in the pandemic when I took over as CEO. I took over right in the middle of the pandemic.
Oh, wow, that's a tough time.
Well, it was again, I mean, the way I look at it was a blessing to be there at that historic time. But in the pandemic, the people in recovery were meeting in parks 6 feet apart with masks, and they were reaching out to all these lonely people, and it just further validated how much transformation occurs and how much these people in recovery want to give back to others. And then the pandemic illuminated how much the rest of society really doesn't understand how important community is, how detrimental loneliness is. And I think we're like finally starting to understand some of those things. And so I think people in recovery, beyond kind of the disease itself and the entrapment and the mechanism and the magnetic pull that use and cravings have, on the other side of it, they just have so much to teach the world about how to live, how to support each other, how to volunteer, that I think is really inspiring.
Talk to us a little bit about the misconceptions that people have about people who struggle with addiction.
I think some of the misconceptions are that they are bad people who don't have hope. They're bad people. They did it to themselves. They should choose better, and that they don't have hope. And it's sad saying that out loud, because I've seen the opposite. And I think the perspective that the recovery community has taught me about looking at things the right way. I mean, Michelle, if you really think about it, our ultimate freedoms really lie in our perspectives, how we choose to see things. Everywhere else we are confined by physical limitations, but it's in our minds and it's in our spirit where oftentimes we are truly free. And I think the way I look at things is when I see the people in the recovery community, and just again how much they give back, it's really something, and it's really transformed me. And so I think the stereotypes that people have about addiction being a moral failing and all that stuff, I've seen it painfully. A lot of people don't understand that Hazelden Betty Ford was actually founded as a mission to be a social reform movement, not a treatment organization.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, say more about that.
76 years ago, there was no addiction treatment really. And even psychiatric institutions didn't want people with addiction. And a group of people found promise in, very early Alcoholics Anonymous principles that were popping up here and there organically around the country. And so they bought a farm, and they bought this farm in Center City, Minnesota, which I'm talking to you from today. And that farm was named after one of the owners, whose name was Hazel. So the farm was called Hazel's Den. So that's where our name comes from, Hazelden. And so they bought this farm as a refuge for people who did not have refuge. And so imagine taking a stand in a time when all of society is against you. And that's what these people did. That's what the mission stood for. That's what it still stands for. And then that mission, limped along and grew and ended up changing the dialogue for the entire country. And then in the early 80s, Mrs. Ford, the First Lady, spoke about her addiction and recovery journey in a way that nobody had before, someone of that prominence. And she had spoken about breast cancer prior to that, so she was a person who was willing to lead and be outspoken for these things. And she also made millions of people feel seen. She made so many people feel seen. I still run into people that maybe met Mrs. Ford one time in her life, or just saw her on a TV show, and they recall those experiences as being transformative. And the people who met her talk about feeling deeply seen and known by her. And so that's the spirit and the legacy that we have as a mission, is this real kind of underdog, organic social reform movement. And I talked to one of the prior CEOs of Hazelden. It was just Hazelden at the time back in the day.
Yeah.
And he said, that's what we've always talked about. We talked about ourselves as a social reform movement. And he said, and if you read the literature early on, it was a mission that was all about dignity. And I circle back to that because I think people with addiction still, when you go to a mainstream hospital, are not given that level of dignity. And I tell this story a lot, and I've said it a lot in so many different shows and media venues. But, if you walk into a beautiful hospital and you ask where the mental health or addiction services are, you're usually sent to the basement or the back annex. And right away, you know that you're a second-class citizen with a second-class illness. And I think our mission, if nothing else, is to show the world that great outcomes are possible, world-class care is possible, and that we are a mission for dignity. That is the contrast to all the stereotypes out there.
Talk a little bit about where addiction comes from.
What's funny is that addiction is more human and more scientific than most mental health conditions. The mechanism for addiction rides along the same mechanism that we have naturally in our brains that promote behaviors for food, sex, and shelter. It is evolutionary. It is inherently human. We are, for example, reinforced to do things that are healthy for us, that keep us alive. And so, if back in caveman days we find food in a forest and a certain thing, or we took a risk and we were able to secure some shelter, we're going to remember that, and we're going to be incentivized and reinforced to repeat that behavior. And therein are the seeds of addiction, and it's a survival mechanism. But the difference is that in modern times, we're a car that was built without brakes, and so back when there just wasn't a lot of resources. And so this kind of, risk-taking and reinforcement of behavior probably helped with survival. And all of a sudden, within a couple of 100 years, we've changed to a society where there's, more reinforcement than we can shake a stick at. And so now people who are prone to addiction, who've had it in their genes for generations, are now being exposed, and they're vulnerable. So there are many environmental triggers for addiction, and trauma and life story, and there's so many things, exposure to substances at an early age, but there's a big genetic component that we need to also talk about. A lot of people in society are running around with a risk for addiction, just like they might run a risk for high blood pressure, and it's in their genetics, or high cholesterol in their genetics. Yes.
Cancer.
That's right. And that does not mean that they'll develop cancer or diabetes, but it does mean that they have, attributes that make them more vulnerable to develop those conditions than others. And addiction is the same way. You have people who are predisposed, and then you unfortunately have some gasoline that gets put on the fire, and so there's a lot of environmental things that also happen in a person's life story, but fundamentally it's not this kind of magical choice, or living a moral life. I wish it was that simple. It's not. I think there's some people are just really powerfully disposed to certain kinds of reinforcements.
I want to talk a little bit about families and how addiction and recovery, how that plays out with families. What's been your experience of, maybe to be more specific, somebody who's struggling with addiction and how that affects the family?
What I would say is sometimes in the opioid epidemic especially, we have, for all the right reasons, wanted to save lives, prevent overdoses, Narcan, medications for opioid use disorders, all the right things. But sometimes those conversations leave out the people who are in the wake of that addiction, the people who are adjacent to that addiction. To put a powerful illustration on this, we have a children's program, and we have these workshops that are multi-day workshops, and these family members bring in kids, and their parents may be actively in addiction, or they may be in their recovery journey somewhere. But these kids have gone through some things, traumatic things. And these young people, when you hear them out, because you have them draw pictures and tell stories, and they do metaphors of like rocks and backpacks to, illustrate different things. And you teach these kids a language, just like you teach them a language to talk about their feelings and talk about divorce in the family. You teach them a language to talk about their loved ones having addiction, and they will say heartbreaking things when they disclose time and again, like, Mom, I thought you were drinking because you didn't love me. I thought you were using substances because you were mad at me, or because I was a bad kid. And right there you see the impact of addiction on families. And while from like a civil rights perspective, there are rights that individuals have to consume substances or not, sometimes that conversation leaves out the family members, because most of them don't have the same opinion about the substance use or how it's affected them. And I think a lot of people can relate to this. So addiction is definitely a systems problem, and it's not like the family caused it. It's more like it affects everybody. Everybody's behavior changes when there's a loved one that has addiction. Everyone is impacted. And we encourage actually everyone to be a part of the solution. What we say is, you didn't cause it. We're not asking you to control it. But actually the science now says you can learn some skills. You can learn to heal. You can improve your quality of life. And on that journey, you might actually even help your loved one get well.
And what are some of those skills that family members need to have while they're supporting somebody who's trying to heal and recover from addiction?
One of the skills is really catching people doing something right.
I love it.
Right.
Good.
You're
Yeah.
gonna catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. I mean, that on its face, I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know if you catch any either way. But the point is, like, if you're stuck in this confrontational environment, and every morning your loved one comes and you know they're hungover and you've argued 15 times about where they were and how late they came in, how much did they drink, and the interrogation. And instead of doing that, maybe just celebrate the fact that they came to breakfast and say, hey, it's really good to see you at breakfast today. And that person then in that moment is disarmed a little bit. They're like, this used to be an argument all the time, but now they're thanking me for breakfast. And you build very slowly, step by step, on things like that. And then maybe a few days later, you might say something like, it's really good to see you at breakfast. And if there's a morning where if you could not use the night before, I'll make your favorite recipe. There's little things that you can do to just reinforce people doing something right. And I think people are like physicians so stuck on the negative aspects of it. And that's not to ignore those conversations, okay? It's not just being positive all the time, but it's really to say from a behavioral psychology standpoint, reinforce the things that you like. So if someone in treatment, whether it's outpatient, residential, or whatnot, says, I don't really want to be here, don't forget the fact that they're in your office talking to you.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
And so, thank you for sharing that honestly with me. And despite all your wishes, what are your top reasons for coming today? I mean, so you can see how you can turn the conversation around, and teaching these family members skills to not swing for the fences all the time, but take the wins that are right in front of them.
That's a great example. Thank you so much for going through that. What advice or preparation would you give to a family who's about to embark on helping somebody in their family go to a facility for addiction recovery?
Yeah, I think you can go a number of different ways. You should definitely do some research, and make sure that you're going to, whether it's outpatient or residential, a credible place that has certifications and accreditations and those kinds of things. And I think that's really important. And then I think get help for yourself. It's not as simple as just getting an interventionist or having it's a journey that you're going to be on with your family member, and getting help for yourself may encourage your loved one to get help, but it will definitely help with your quality of life. And then there are many paths in. And so some people start with outpatient care, but the important part is really engaging the family member and then being involved, and not in an intrusive violation of privacy way, but being involved and supportive and learning some skills for yourself. And you really have to take it as a family systems thing, and you have to have that approach. I think because of stigma, I think also just common thoughts that people have about parenting. I think when I see a lot of young people, some of the parents, especially the fathers, are don't want to deal with the addiction directly, and if you really dig down, it's they blame themselves, or they wonder if they've done something wrong if they acknowledge the addiction. So it just goes to show you that the entire family needs help, regardless of whether they're what kind of journey that they think they're on.
That makes a lot of sense, because the parents need to go through that process themselves of understanding those feelings that they have that might be getting in the way of processing those issues.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and there's a lot there that family members and parents, they have kind of a narrative that sometimes they don't even know they're running around with. And it's cause and effect, and it's chicken or the egg, and it's whose fault it is. One of the ways you know that a disorder or a condition is stigmatized is that people really get stuck on attribution. Who caused it? What is it? And there's something also unique about behavioral health where a lot of the diagnoses we throw around have quite different meanings for people. So a young person with ADHD One young person might say, finally, this diagnosis helps me understand why I try to pay attention and read and I just can't stay focused. Another child may find it an intrusion on their autonomy, that, you're trying to tell me that I'm defective and that I can't do it on my own. And so you see kind of in a spectrum that the diagnoses that we just kind of throw around have all kinds of like symbolism and meaning and cause and effect things for us. And I think that's especially true in families where over time we learn to internalize and we have these narratives about why the use occurs, what can be done about it. And so the family members need a lot of help actually through that journey so that they can improve their quality of life and that they can find other people or help their loved one. But the good news is that through that process, the evidence suggests that the family involvement works, that by and large, when families are involved, outcomes are better.
Yeah, you're right. Research does show that. How do you think we've done as a field about shifting from blaming families and parents to not?
I think it's rooted in the very nature of addiction, and again, some of the stigma where it just, regardless of the generation, if you organically let people observe addiction in families, they'll go to giving people advice that's sometimes not helpful or it's kind of a natural thing that happens, But I think as a field, we've made some progress for sure in teaching people skills and how to be effective without judgment, or shaming. And there are a lot of tension points because, right or wrong, many of these families are stuck in a number of dysfunctional patterns. They just absolutely are, because that's the nature of addiction. And how do you then lay that out in a way that makes the family members feel seen and feel like they're a part of the solution? And so, Al-Anon, I think, is a great community for people. But just like, any other self-help groups, there are people there, they're not professionals. They're sharing stories and there's anecdotes and there's, cliches and things like that. And I think if people really want to get the help they need in a fine-tuned way, they're going to have to do some work, but with a family counselor or someone who knows how to navigate these situations, that uses evidence-based modalities. And if they find that venue, I think they can have an experience that is remarkably different than maybe families encountered 30 or 40 years ago.
If loved ones and family members can really open themselves up to the journey of healing for somebody that's going through addiction, what will they see and experience that's wonderful?
What I know is that, just like we talked about people in recovery who give back, people whose family members have gone through treatment, even if they've returned to use, even if sometimes they've passed away, unfortunately, for one reason or another, we find that these families, just like the people in recovery, are incredibly grateful people who want to give back, and they've been touched for a lifetime by the experience of recovery. And we find that time and again. And so I think that's when you ask that question, that's kind of what I think about with these family members, is that they are incredible people who give back. And so then if you deconstruct that, what inspired them so much for a lifetime and how have they been transformed? And I would say it's akin to their loved one having cancer and bringing that's what they say. Those are the words they use, is that you've helped bring our loved one back to us. They don't forget that. And it is such a powerful testimony. And people who serve on our board, people who volunteer, people who donate money, people who leave estate gifts to us, so many of the notes are family members. And they say, you saved so-and-so's life. You brought, our son, daughter, husband back to us the way we remembered them.
And then what would be the hardest thing that people need to gear themselves up for experiencing as they enter the recovery journey?
I think all the ups and downs. Yeah, when people return to use, or maybe they haven't returned to use, but some mental health issues creep back up, or some behaviors that weren't healthy come back, and those things are hard because every time you're in such a desperate space that anytime you see sun, you're like, let it be sunny forever. And life just isn't like that. But the research says a person will enter recovery, and the first 6 months of recovery can be a challenge. You need a lot of support. And that's why at Hazelden Betty Ford, we know from our outcomes that if people do residential, they're better off if they do outpatient care and continue on with us, because after that initial honeymoon, you have a lot of bills of life, if you will, that come due. You might have to look at your friends. You might have to look at your job differently. You might have to examine a lot of things about your life, and that can be a lonely experience. And we encourage people to go to meetings and go to groups and mental health therapists and whatnot. And once they cross about a year in recovery, their prognosis picks up quite a bit. But people can take, it might take 2 tries at treatment in some kind of setting. It might take 6 tries. There's just different people have a different path to that journey, and I think that's very hard for family members to experience that short-term kind of up and down experience, because you have your hopes up again. And it's that's where the skills training is really important, to have that perspective. And because it is in some ways like if a diabetic's blood sugar isn't well controlled, we wouldn't blame them or get mad at them. But there's another side of me that says, in some ways this is different than diabetes, because the impact it has is so, the gravity of the things that happen when there's return to use is so much more personal, in a way. And so it just goes to show you that families need a lot of support, but many of them find their way. And just like the patients, if they stay engaged in care and engaged in support and find that community, they find their way.
I can imagine listeners listening to this and just hearing the power of everything you're talking about, and knowing a loved one that is struggling and wanting this experience for them, this healing experience that you're talking about, and coming into their own and being seen and heard. And what's your recommendation for somebody who wants to get a family member help? That family member doesn't want help.
Engage in family services yourself, because you might learn skills, you might learn ways to approach that person, and stay engaged. Continue that conversation with the loved one. Make sure it's non-judgmental and open, but you can guide them, and you can express how you feel about things. And there are many paths to addiction treatment. And of course, we want to respect everyone's autonomy, but sometimes autonomy needs a little nudge. And a lot of people, fortunately or not, come to addiction because they got a little nudge, and it was either from their job or their family member or some kind of legal thing or a health scare.
Yeah.
And it happens a lot, and it works. And so I think if you're a family member, just know that you play a role in it and that it's not your fault, but that you should be engaged. You should continue that conversation and not give up on it, and even if there's disagreements, even if that loved one doesn't get help right away, I've never had a family member regret staying persistent.
What do you think are some of the biggest environmental factors that people want to consider to help support them in their recovery and their success?
Well, people, places, and things is the old adage, but if you because there's a lot of triggers that remind you of the using patterns. And so if Thursday night poker, or Friday night at a social event, or certain friends and settings and thoughts and feelings, and what we teach people how to do is to really think about their behaviors in a way to say, hey, there are these antecedents, things that happened before the behavior. I was feeling this way. This was the environment. These were the people I was around. These were the thoughts that were going through my mind. And we teach them how to map that and to act differently when they recognize that. Someone, for example, might say, like, I tend to use when I'm angry at home and I'm in my backyard alone, and my parents have gone to sleep, or my significant other has gone to sleep, and then I'm using, out in the back, patio. And initially, when they have that feeling of anger, they don't see it as a trigger. They think they're just righteously angry. They're angry about something. But over time, they learn to not question it, but to say, oh, I'm feeling a certain way. I better be careful. I'm going to call somebody. I'm going to reach out to somebody because this isn't a good spot for me. And I don't want to go down the train of, I'm rightfully angry because so-and-so did this and that and this and that. I'm going to just recognize it as a symptom of something that's going to happen later. And that's just one example where you teach people how to build a healthy life around them. And that's really essentially what recovery is about. It's not the absence of substances just gives people the platform to really work on themselves. I think the other thing that's really important in the environment is to volunteer.
I love that.
And this is something that, as I was reading research on self-help groups, and this is kind of a criticism of mental health treatment in general, I think, because I grew up in the mental health world, and the mental health world is very sterile. It's very medications, algorithm, some XYZ therapy. It's very individual. It's not systems-based. There's no ties to community. And if they do self-help groups, it's a lot of take. It's not a lot of give. But there's something about recovery that encourages people to volunteer. And that volunteerism is the flywheel for community. And a lot of us in society talk a lot about the need for community. And we all cry about, how community is falling apart. And we don't realize that things like volunteerism actually are the flywheel of community. People giving of themselves to contribute. And it could be talents, time, treasure. It could be anything. But that's really what, AA and treatment and other things were founded on, is these communities. And so that's really important in their environment, is to not just take, but to give and to participate and to give back. And you find this with people who are many years in recovery. They'll sponsor other people. They help other people because it's also good for them. It's a reminder to them of their journey, and it affirms and validates the progress that they've made, and they feel useful and purposeful. I would say if you look at any kind of community, you can tell how healthy it is from a vital signs perspective by looking at the amount of volunteerism that community has.
What's your biggest wish for people out there who are very well aware of addiction and how it's playing a role in their life?
My wish is that they could see what's on the other side.
Nice.
I wish they could see the hope, the connections, the community, the love and support that is there. I think that's just the hardest part is, at Hazelden Betty Ford, we have an incredible product of services, but it's one of those things that people don't realize the value of it until you're on the other side, because you're so beleaguered by the addiction and the fear of giving up, and you know what I mean, and what it might mean.
Yes.
And I just wish more people would be able to experience kind of the joy and the gratitude and all the things that we've talked about in this past hour, because that's what recovery is really about. And then I think the more we can talk about it in society in that way, the more people can use their imagination. And I think that's the kind of tidal wave that would change stigma for good. Instead of just saying people have diseases and they need to be accepted as people, if you could really show the kind of impact that people in recovery have, the kind of journey. And we've had conversations like this in society before about other things. Like, it was hard to imagine at a time that secondhand smoke, despite the science, was harmful. We had to have that conversation somewhere. We had to kind of create a thing, and there was a nothing before.
Yes.
And there's a lot of things that we are aware of that have kind of entered our psyche that weren't there before. And I think we need that kind of dialogue with addiction so that people who are struggling can see the value of recovery at its face. And so that's what I wish for.
That is a great way to end. And I just know, Dr. Joe, that people are they're gonna really be helped by this, by what you've shared with us today. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to be on this show so people can hear the power of what you have to share and the work that you're involved in. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it was great to be here, Michelle, and great talking to you. And thank you for all your great work at Nexus Family Healing.
You can find more information about Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation at hazeldenbettyford.org. There's also some tremendous resources on their website that have to do with substance use disorder and other mental health conditions. It is well worth your time to check out. In This Family is produced by John Moe, and the music is provided by Jeremy Messersmith. You can learn more about Nexus by visiting nexusfamilyhealing.org. Thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I really hope you recommend In This Family to family and friends, post about us on social, and leave a rating or review. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray. See you again next time.